Welcome to Survivor Reentry Project Webinar Number 2, Series 2, Best Practices for Working with Survivors of Trafficking in Vacatur Cases, co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and the ABA Center for Professional Development. Moderating the program today is Bonnie Carlson. Bonnie is an attorney at the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence in Washington, D.C. And welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Sandra. Joining me on the program today, we have Kate Mogulescu, who is the Survivor Reentry Project's lead attorney and director of the Criminal Defense Advocacy Clinic at Brooklyn Law School. We have Christine Evans, the legal director at the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. And we have Miriam Goodman, who is the clinical director of Women's Prison Association's Alternative to Incarceration program, Justice Home. And Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar builds on the prior 3 webinars that Survivor Reentry Project has offered, which, just to review, have gone over the basics of the criminal legal system, the impact of arrests and conviction records for people who have come through the criminal legal system, and then most recently working with survivors to clear their criminal records through the vacatur or expungement process. This webinar intends to provide attorneys a deeper understanding of how trauma impacts clients they may be working with, how it impacts our work with clients overall, but specifically in working with survivors of human trafficking through a criminal legal process, how we can be better attuned to emotional needs and emotional health as we work to provide legal remedies that are ultimately empowering for clients. So today, our goals are to really learn how best to work with survivors of trafficking in post-conviction cases. What does trauma mean on an interpersonal level, a systemic level, and how does trauma impact survivors of violence? We are going to go through what common trauma reactions are in clients that we're working with and how we as practitioners can develop appropriate responses. And really our overarching goal here is to build culturally competent representation that takes into account our clients' experience and perspective. This is going to apply to survivors of trafficking, but it's also going to apply to clients across the board, clients who have experienced trauma for a variety of reasons. So we're hoping this will be useful to our very specific legal purpose, but also in general practice. Before we get started today, we want to have a sense of who we are joining with virtually, and so we're going to ask you to take a quick poll. Please indicate if you are a public defender, another criminal defense attorney, a civil legal services attorney, a pro bono attorney, a social worker or case manager, a prosecutor, a judge, or another member of law enforcement. Again, we're going to ask people that are participating to indicate if you're a public defender, a different type of criminal defense attorney, a civil legal services attorney, pro bono attorney, social worker, prosecutor, judge, or other member of law enforcement. Once we have a sense of who our audience is today, or while we're waiting for the poll to finish actually, I want to just say that I am so pleased to have our 2 presenters with us today. Miriam Goodman and Christine Evans are absolute experts in this field. Both have been working with survivors in various capacities for a number of years and have really refined the type of practice that we want to see proliferate across the country, a practice that is survivor-centered, that takes into account how legal systems can both marginalize people, but then with the proper representation also further empower and work to improve people's lives and move them forward to independence and safety. We're going to start our presentation with Miriam. And Miriam's going to introduce herself, tell a little about what she does on a daily basis when she's not leading webinars in my office, and then take us through some basic foundational principles about trauma.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Kate and ABA and everyone for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor to be on a webinar with such, as Kate said, leaders in this work. And so we're going to spend some time talking about trauma, but a little bit about me. So I currently am the program director at the Women's Prison Association. WPA has been around for a very long time, since 1845, and we have been supporting women who have any contact with the criminal legal systems since then. Excuse me. Our alternative to incarceration program that's called Justice Home is a community-based alternative to incarceration program that is really specialized in working with female-identified folks who are survivors of a lot of different types of trauma. But we do work with a lot of people whose experiences qualify them as trafficking survivors. We provide advocacy in court for somebody's release if they're currently incarcerated to our program. And if people are already in the community, we advocate for them to be able to stay in their community so that they can continue to build a life of safety and a life of what they want rather than being incarcerated. We provide wraparound holistic case management, and really our approach is trauma-informed. We try to operate from an anti-oppressive approach, which really means that we try to give back voice and power wherever we can. We recognize that people are mandated to our program from a court, which takes away someone's choice, right, and power. And so wherever we can give that back, we really do that. So, and that can look something as small as what day of the week would you like to meet up and what time, and working around our participants' schedule rather than expect them to work around ours. And it can be something, you know, to the point of, okay, so the court's mandated you to do drug treatment too. What kind of drug treatment? Where would you like to go? Because we really believe that we're working with adults who know themselves better than anybody else is going to know them, and we want them to have buy-in to the program. Before I was at WPA, I spent about 8 years at another organization called the Center for Court Innovation, where I was helping create alternatives to jail for people arrested on prostitution charges. So I've been working with survivors of trauma and trafficking for about the last 10 years. So without further ado, let's get going and talking about trauma. So you might be wondering why there's a tree on your first slide. And the reason for that is I personally am a visual learner, and I think that sometimes we talk about things in theory and it just goes over, at least it goes over my head. So the reason that I use this image is because I understand trauma to be often the root cause of how someone thinks, feels, and acts. And on the next slide, I have given you a very concrete definition of trauma. But if we think about trauma as something that happens to an individual that is truly life-threatening, that threatens their existence or a community's existence, it's not just drama, it's trauma. And I have had a client before tell me how she's been dramatized versus traumatized, and it's something to think through. But okay, looking at the tree. So a lot of times in the work that I do as a social worker, and I'm sure that many of you do as attorneys, we are given somebody in the form of a file or a label, right? It can be a diagnosis, it can be a charge, it can be whatever it is. And that, to me, is really the leaves that we're seeing, right? And so we make a lot of judgments about a person based on the label that they come to us. So whether you're picking up a new case and you see this charge as attempted murder, you're going to have a reaction to that, or prostitution, or whatever it might be. And same is true in the mental health world when you see certain diagnoses. And so really what we're seeing is that the leaves and branches and not the roots of where things come from. So trauma-informed care is understanding that there's a reason for why someone is behaving the way they are in front of you, thinking the way they are, feeling the way they are, and that we need to remember that there is a root cause, even if we don't always have all the details, and that what we're seeing are the leaves and branches. And if you think about it, if somebody made a judgment of you, right, on your worst moment, it's, I don't know, everybody's in different places, but it's extremely hot in New York right now. And on an unair-conditioned subway car, if someone made a judgment about me, right, they only saw my leaf and my branch and didn't connect to the root of what my day might have been or how I react to heat, they can judge me as maybe not the kindest human in the world, right? So the whole point being that the roots are really about thinking through why. Why is this person the way that they are? One of our program graduates, who I have her permission in stealing this from her, when she saw this tree and I was talking to her about trauma, she made the beautiful point that what we end up doing so often in our society is not caring about the roots, ignoring the roots, so the tree dies and the leaves turn brown. But rather than addressing the root cause, we end up spray painting the leaves so that we try to put Band-Aids onto solutions rather than trying to get into the nitty-gritty. So what is this trauma that I speak of? So this is a pretty technical definition, but I think the key takeaways is that one, trauma applies to an individual and it can apply to a community. And as we're going to spend a substantial amount of time talking through are the different ways that trauma impacts individuals and communities. And a lot of times in trauma trainings, we end up only focusing on the individual. And we really need to be mindful of how communities are traumatized, whether that's traumatized because of marginalization and racism and poverty, policing, you name it. And so, again, I think the core thing to understand about trauma versus drama or anything else is that the person or community's experience of it is one that felt life-threatening. It made somebody feel truly, at their core, worthless. And it's unlikely that somebody, is like walking down the street and the traumatic thing happens and they're like, whoop, now I'm rattled to my core and I feel traumatized. What we end up seeing with the people that we work with a lot are that it's not just one event, right? It's a combination of a lot of different traumatic events that really can impact a person's understanding of self or a community's understanding of worth. Okay. So we're going to spend some time talking about micro and macro forms of trauma. And just for definition purposes, I'm going to actually go ahead to fast forward to a few slides ahead, and then we'll come back. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So the reason that I'm pulling this up, and if you are spacing out and eating lunch and you take away nothing else from my part of talking, I hope it's this slide here. And the reason for that is it's breaking down the understanding of interpersonal and systemic trauma. So what is interpersonal trauma? Interpersonal trauma is what we tend to think of when we think about trauma. It's things like childhood sexual abuse, childhood physical abuse, domestic violence, rape, neglect. This is not an exhaustive list. It could go on and on and on. But the key thing to understand about interpersonal trauma is that there's intent behind that action, so that one person intentionally caused harm to someone else. And why that person might have caused harm, we're going to talk about a little later, but we could do a whole other webinar on. But to remember that if the person, let's take a child who's being hurt by a caregiver, so now here they're having this experience where the person who's supposed to love and care for them is also causing them hurt and pain. And that's an extremely hard thing intentionally, right? It's to them. It's not just random. And so that's if you're a young person or an adult who's continuously hurt by somebody who's supposed to love and care for you, it will impact how you understand your sense of worth. So what we tend to do as humans is when things don't make sense, so for a kid, if it doesn't make sense while my mom is hurting me, then we turn inwards, right? We internalize it and we assume, well, it must then be me because nothing else makes sense. So if you think about defendants and participants, whatever terms everybody uses, has had a continuous experience of this, how that would impact how they see themselves, their worth, their importance. And I used to use the example of that interpersonal trauma to make it sound different than random, to bring in natural disasters, right? So a tsunami, for example, is not intentionally going to destroy Kate's house and not mine. It's going to destroy any house in its path. And I used to leave it there because I felt like, okay, now we understand intent versus not intent. However, I was listening to a podcast about a prom in Oklahoma, and that during the prom, a tornado came through the town, and it took a really weird path that would destroy one part of one house on a street and not the other. And when the kids came out of, when it was safe to come out of the school after the prom, you heard them internalize the random violence, right? So you heard kids saying things like, maybe if I were nicer to my mom, my room wouldn't have been destroyed. Maybe if I hadn't cheated on my test, my house wouldn't have been destroyed. And it was just listening to them talk was a helpful reminder that even when there isn't intent behind the hurt, that it can feel and be internalized as such. And I think this is important to remember too as we talk about triggers and trauma reactions, because sometimes what will happen when we're working with people, attorneys, social workers, care worker, whoever, is that we don't realize that our action, we're not intentionally trying to hurt the person we're working with, but it can be internalized or feel like we are because of all the experiences of intentional hurt that people have gone through. So then we look at, and I would also just want to say this 3 columns here are trying to simplify an extremely complicated idea. So then we look at the systemic forms of trauma and oppression. And as attorneys and people who are working in systems, it's extremely important that we acknowledge that systems can hurt and oppress. So systems being things like the court system, foster care, education, law enforcement, healthcare. We can go on and on and on. And the reason that it's important for us to pay attention to this, one is because a lot of the people that we serve and a lot of survivors of trafficking end up in a lot of those systems. And these systems are not made to see an individual or understand the context of a person's experience. And rather than to see them for the individual and what's going on in their life. You know, one I think is extremely important, and if you haven't already watched it, to watch the documentary 13th, to get an understanding and foundation of the criminal legal system. When you think about mass incarceration, and where does it come from, and why does it exist, and the 13th Amendment that looks at the loophole that was created for who has rights and who doesn't, right? After slavery was supposedly, we got rid of it, and now the 13th Amendment created this loophole so that people who were incarcerated were treated very similarly. Again, something to consider and keep in mind when we're talking about people who are being processed through systems. And then we have the structural forms of trauma and oppression, the things that are in our society, whether we want them to be or not, and we have to acknowledge things like racism and poverty, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, any other ism you can think of. And the reason that I believe that it's really important to acknowledge all 3 levels is that the individual that you are working with is operating through all of these and now is presenting before you in reaction to all of this. So, for example, if we take a young, let's take a 17-year-old young man of color, and he discloses to his school counselor that he has experienced sexual abuse, which we don't talk about, but men experience sexual violence as well. So now we're in that interpersonal column, right? So he's saying that he's been sexually abused at home. The school social worker, as a mandated reporter, must call child services. So now we're in the systemic column, right? And because trauma, those roots, and remember, think about the roots, are often not addressed, or they're knowledge, but they're not understood as the foundation and the core. His experience doesn't get addressed. So he gets removed from home and gets put into a group home because he's almost 18, and that roots are not addressed. So he starts reacting in socially, acceptable or not acceptable, social ways that our people react. So for young men, that might be with violence, that might be acting out on other kids in the home, that might be not listening to following rules. So he gets kicked out, gets passed from one place to the other, again, because the system is not able to see him as an individual who's reacting to his experiences of trauma. And eventually, he has a case of the F-its, and he decides to leave the foster care system, and he's on his own. And he has to survive, and so he steals something to eat, and he gets arrested for it. And now he's before probably what is likely to be a white male judge who's going to see this 6'1" young black man and make, because of racism and judgments and bias, is far more likely going to send him to do some time or some sort of harsher sentence imposed than if it was his white counterpart, right? And so now he goes into jail for a day or two and is told, okay, when you're released, go talk to a social worker. And his question is going to be like, why in the world should I do that after my experience, my individual experience, my roots were never taken into account this whole time? And so why did I use that example, and what does that have to do with trafficking survivors? So for trafficking survivors, not only have they had multiple experiences through interpersonal, systemic, and structural forms of trauma and oppression that have ignored the context of what's going on for them, there is such deep shame in the experience of being trafficked, of being pimped out, of giving all your money to somebody. It's a very tabooed thing to talk about, and people are feel a lot of shame in bringing this up. And so, again, if we think about the people you're working with, that we want to remind ourselves that there are roots. And I should say that trauma, and the reason we're even talking about this is to hopefully help people's practice, but it's not to make an excuse for people's behaviors or how they might treat you or anything of that nature. It's really to help us enhance our understanding of context, and if we can understand an individual's context, it can increase our ability to connect with them and kind of get to what's going on. Okay, so yes. So again, why is it important to talk about? All the reasons I've already mentioned, but here are some more. That when somebody experiences childhood trauma and neglect, that they're more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, they're more likely to be arrested as an adult, and more likely to commit a violent crime. And the reason that this is important to know is that it's not that something just happens, it's out of the blue, right? That this chronic experience of neglect, both, again, interpersonally and systemically, leaves people without options, right? And so there's a poverty of not only money or food, but of resources, of trust, of people that they can connect to. One study that I know was done at the Center for Court Innovation and interviewed homeless youth. They interviewed, I believe, 125 people, and it was like 1 out of 10 had an adult that they trusted, that they could talk to, right? 1 out of 10. And so if you don't have an adult that you can talk to, that you trust, all of a sudden when you turn 18 and you are an adult, it doesn't mean that you're going to instantly be able to trust people again, right? Because our reactions to the world and how we interact in the world is an accumulation of experiences that we have in our life. So now as attorneys that are trying to connect with people, here you come and somebody's been hurt so many times through, or not, but so many times, but even if they haven't, even if you know nothing about them except that they've been in the juvenile justice system or criminal justice system, foster care, you know that something has happened because they have been put into a system that is very unlikely to have heard their voice and heard their experience. Okay, so trauma reactions. I've used the term reaction rather than symptom because I think it's very unfair to tell somebody that they've been hurt and now you are sick, right, and you have symptoms of an illness, rather than you're reacting to the things that you've been through. It's the same as if any living person put your hand in a fire, it would burn. That was just what your hand would do. But how my hand would heal versus yours versus somebody else's is going to be very individualized because of my own resiliency, my own ability to heal pain. So I, again, use reactions because they make sense in the context of the experience that the person has had. And I think what is incredible about people, and definitely about trafficking survivors, is their resiliency. And people do whatever it takes to survive the pain that they've been through. So to use an example of this, there was a movie that came out a few years ago called 127 Hours. It was based on a true story about the guy who went hiking in the woods and a boulder got stuck on his arm. And he used his dinky little knife to cut off his arm. And people saw this movie and heard this story and were like, wow, what an amazing story of survival. Like, I don't think I could cut off my own arm with a dinky knife. And I ask you, if you didn't know that there was a boulder on his arm and you just heard a story about a guy went in the woods and tried to cut off his arm with a pocket knife, the reaction would probably be like, he's crazy, he's not okay, why would he do such a thing, right? And this is sort of what we do to trauma survivors and trafficking survivors all the time. We forget that there's a boulder. There's a reason for why that person is doing what they're doing. And we like to label things all the time in our society because we need to bill for things and make sense of this crazy world. But really what people are doing is they're surviving and they're being resilient. And in the work that we do at Women's Prison Association, we end up often working with people who have been criminalized for surviving, right? And I think that that's true for many people that all of you serve as well, that they're incarcerated or have been arrested for trying to figure out how to survive, whether that's that they had to steal something from somebody, or they're taking the blame because they're too scared to say what's going on, or they were forced to do something, whatever it might be. And so the last point on this about reactions is really that trauma reactions are often misdiagnosed or overlooked as symptoms of other mental illness. And I'm not saying that mental illness doesn't exist. That's not the point of this. It's to say that we think back to that tree, okay, and you think about all the labels that someone can come in. So you get a file and they have some charge and you think that they're bipolar and all these things. We can get so caught up in the label that we forget about the root. Why is this person behaving this way? Why is this person looking like this? And the other thing is when we're trying to do advocacy work for an individual, we're not the only ones that have reactions to certain labels. Systems do as well. And so being able to not get stuck only with a label, let's take a mental illness diagnosis that's very common for trafficking survivors, is multiple personality disorder or bipolar disorder. Those have strong meanings to a judge that's looking at a case, to an attorney that's looking at the case. But when we look at it as perhaps what's going on is trauma, and we have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, it really changes a person's reaction. And I've worked with people who are getting their diagnosis changed because really, truly what's going on is that they're reacting to their trauma, PTSD. They've gotten their children back quickly. They've gotten released from jail much faster. It really has an impact because PTSD is something, I'm not saying everyone should be diagnosed with PTSD, but it says to people in authority that you are reacting to something, you're not sick. And those are two very different things. Okay. So trauma does impact your brain. I am not a neuroscientist, and I am not going to pretend to be one. But if you want to read a really good book by a neuropsychiatrist, I highly recommend The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. It's amazing. He's a genius, and he does an incredible job of talking about the impact of trauma both on the brain, but also how social development plays an impact, and community reaction plays an impact on trauma survivors. So really, the only thing to really think about in this slide is that this is your brain on trauma, right? So in a moment of the trauma is happening, or when you are triggered, meaning something reminds you of a traumatic event, which we'll get to in a second, all these parts of your brain that are able to think about, have consequential thinking, long-term thinking, shut down, and we go to our fight, flight, freeze mode. And so we aren't able to think about what might the repercussions of my action be because we're surviving, we're in survival mode. And fight and flight are pretty self-explanatory, and we hear about it quite frequently, right? But freeze is something that happens to so many survivors, and it's a reaction that people start judging themselves for it, and others start judging them. This is when if you ever watch Law and Order or anything of that nature, and you see an episode where they have like a rape survivor on the stand or something, a survivor of sexual assault on the stand, we often hear these questions of, well, why didn't you call the police right away? Why didn't you do this right away? And because it's a freeze reaction is normal. So let me give you another example to help make sense of this. Imagine for a moment that in the room that you're in right now, all of a sudden a big grizzly bear walked into the room. Do you think that you would calmly be able to say to yourself, okay, I need to take this exit to this exit so I can leave and stay calm? No. You would probably try to get out of that situation as quickly as possible. Potentially, you've watched a lot of National Geographic and know how to fight off a bear, but not recommended. But really what would happen is for a moment when that bear came into the room, you would freeze and sit, because your body and mind is going to shut down and say to yourself, why is there a bear in here, right? What am I going to do? There's a freeze moment. And so for trauma survivors, that freeze moment is real. And it's when maybe they're not able to make decisions that looking back they wish they had. Now over time, and if you are continuously living in trauma, right, if it's all around you and this is what you're dealing with regularly, and you get triggered a lot, the fight, flight, freeze becomes longer-term reactions, which we're going to dissect in a second. So really, I think that the reason that we bring this up is to say that it does impact the neurology, like your brain. Trauma has impact, and that this reaction of fight, flight, freeze is what any animal does when they're facing danger, and we need to acknowledge that freeze happens. So when you start wanting to ask, well, why didn't you do this, to catch yourself to say, you know what? Maybe they froze, because it's extraordinarily common. Okay, so we're going to break down some of the sort of longer-term reactions that can impact a person who's been through a lot of trauma, and particularly, again, for survivors of trafficking. And these categories are based on the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, because that's the only language that we have that I can really get into it. So things like intrusive thoughts and feelings. So we all have these, right? Perhaps you're having them right now as I'm talking to you through a computer or a phone, that you're sitting here and you're technically listening to me, but your mind is elsewhere, right? You're thinking about, like, did I leave the coffee maker on? What am I having for dinner? Intrusive thoughts about something that is not this webinar. And that's most of the time, for most of us, when that intrusive thought is not a traumatic intrusive thought, we think about it, it passes, we let it go. However, when that intrusive thought is a memory of, or an experience of a traumatic event from the past, it can cause a reaction in a person. Intrusive thoughts and flashbacks are a bit different. We don't have to get too technical, but flashbacks are an experience that feel like they are happening again, like you are in a movie again, reliving an experience, whereas intrusive thoughts are more flashes of a memory, not that you're back in that moment. And the reason to bring this up is that it can really impact a person's presentation when they're before you. So if you're speaking to them and you're talking to them about something that doesn't even have anything to do with their trauma history, but all of a sudden somebody who comes in your office and has a strong perfume on, and all of a sudden your client starts acting really differently, right? Perhaps they're having the smell of that perfume reminded them of something from their past, and they're having an intrusive thought about that violent experience. So it can impact someone's behavior, and sometimes the way that this might play out is you think you're having a good conversation with your person, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, is this over yet? Can I go? I need to go. Or I need to go have a cigarette. I need to get out of this room, right? This need to get out and move so that you can ease yourself of the intrusive thought. And so just quick ways that you can kind of deal with this when you're meeting with people is if you notice a big change in behavior, to take a pause. I know we all are pressed for time, and just ask, hey, did I say something just right now that upset you, or where did you go, if it seems like they kind of left that conversation. But also, if you're meeting them in person, to have things around that people can kind of distract themselves with while paying attention. A piece of paper that they can doodle on, something to play with in their hands. Just thinking about how are ways that people can sort of stay grounded in all of this. And physical pain is on there because for many survivors of trauma, people it goes inward, and so they have pain that they can't explain very well, and they go to hospitals and doctors can't figure it out. But really, what's going on is that their reaction is very much in their body, and we see this most commonly with survivors of very young early sexual abuse, particularly if the sexual abuse was experienced pre-verbal. People internalize that pain in their bodies a lot. So it's not to say that if you're working with someone and they're having pains in their bodies that they shouldn't go to a doctor, of course, but to be aware that they might not be some annoying hypochondriac. In fact, that might be how their body is coping with the pain that they've experienced. Avoidance. This is one that we probably all know very well, right? Who likes to show up to things that are going to be somewhat painful? Like for me, I hate the dentist because why would I want to go there and get my teeth, my mouth all hurt? So I avoid it as much as I possibly can. So people avoid things that remind them of, that are painful or remind them of violence from the past. And so that can be things like as simple as, for example, my brother as a kid was bit by a dog. He's now full-blown adult, and still to this day when he sees a dog, big dog, coming down the street, he might cross the street because he's trying to avoid being there with that dog. But a lot of times it's not as, you're not as aware of what we're doing, and so it might be like you made an appointment to talk with your client about their case, and all of a sudden they have 3 other appointments that day because it's so hard to come in to focus about what might be going on, right? And this also can be emotional avoidance, so people who present kind of numb. So they're sitting there telling you something horrific that's happened to them, but they're not displaying emotion, and that can be very off-putting for us. Well, and we start questioning, if this really happened, why aren't you crying right now? Why are you laughing right now instead of crying, which is a common way that humans deal when things are overwhelming and they're trying to avoid it. We can laugh instead of cry. And so the way that we sort of address avoidance in our program is before it happens to put it out there. So to say to somebody, listen, it might be really hard sometimes to come in and talk to us because it means that you have to address, you have a case, whatever is going on in your life. And before you decide to just not come in, just call. Just give a call, even if you can't physically come in. If you're working in a courthouse, to talk with if you're having trouble having someone come in, perhaps seeing law enforcement with guns on them and going through metal detectors is extremely triggering. And so we've done things like we'll meet you outside, we'll go in together, right? Like ways to address avoidance by addressing it so people can't be avoidant or little harder. Okay. Hyperarousal. So this is where we see that, like, can't sit still, moving all over the place, on edge. And in children, often you see kids who are getting diagnosed with ADD and ADHD. While it totally exists unto itself, a lot of times what people are actually seeing is that inability to sit still. Because imagine that slide with the brain for a moment. If you are constantly scanning for danger, if you are living in a life that has been so full of there's constant movement, constant trauma, you're going to be looking around at all times, like actually looking around or emotionally looking around for where that next person or thing is going to come from that will hurt you. So it can mimic reactions that are similar to ADD and ADHD, and what's challenging, again, just to always question a diagnosis is if what's actually going on is that the child is not being able to pay attention because of violence that's going on at home, but they get prescribed that cocktail of medications for ADHD, and it's not working, right? Because that's not actually, again, the root cause of what's going on. These are the hyperarousal are things that you will see physically often when working with survivors, that shaking leg, again, moving around, can't focus, interrupting a lot, not being able to stay concentrated. So again, thinking about things that you can do to help people stay grounded and focused. Taking breaks if it's a long meeting, having, again, paper, things that people can just doodle and stay focused. If playing a game on their phone is the way that someone's going to be able to concentrate, people are very good at multitasking, then perhaps that's one way that they can stay focused and grounded, right? Really just taking that second to see how can you stay put and help me out. And reenactment. So this one, you know, listen, if people have had their power and control taken from them, both from interpersonal trauma and macro forms of trauma and oppression, we all try to take back that power and control wherever we can. And so often there's a power struggle that can happen because the person with more power, let's say in the case of a criminal defense attorney, in that moment has a lot of power because they're that person's advocate to get them out of jail or to have them not go into jail, right? And so whoever has the more power, the person with less power might try to gain back power wherever they can. So this struggle can go on. You might say, I need you to do A. They don't know you yet. They don't have the trust yet. They don't, and you think about all the things we've talked about already, the roots, people's experiences of trust. And so they might try to power play back and forth. And what ends up happening is that we use bad language like this client is manipulative, this client doesn't want services, rather than to stop and say, okay, what is this power struggle about? Let me just stop trying to get someone to do what I need them to do. Let me try to take a step back and see if I can hear what they're trying to tell me because we're missing something, right? In our program, we always talk about walking with people, not pulling them along. And when we get into power struggles, that's really what we're talking about, like acknowledging that, yes, you have 2 seconds to talk to this person before their case is called, but how can you at least start off that conversation and giving back some of that power and control? Hi, how are you? How are you doing today? Simple as that, it just sets a different tone, right? So when you are finding yourself using terms like manipulative or not wanting programming or services from you, I would ask you to challenge yourselves and to think about what's going on in that moment. Okay, moving right along here. Dissociation. So dissociation is that longer-term freeze. It's that separation of your mind from your body, right? And this is often an attempt at first, particularly for survivors of sexual violence, to survive the trauma of sexual assault or sexual abuse. But over time, it becomes really challenging for individuals because it looks like big space out. This is, again, why often we see the diagnosis of ADD or ADHD for people because they look like they're completely checked out, which they are, but they're often checked out because that's their defense mechanism of survival. So a quick way to, if you think that someone you're talking to is checking out, can simply just tap the table a little bit. You don't have to be like, where are you and what's going on? Just a little like, hey, come back to me, come back to the room, because talking about the things that you are talking about with your clients is very overwhelming. Okay. So thinking about trauma reactions, again, I said I'm a visual person myself, so we often think about trauma at the things that people have been through, but the way that people react are the things that we might see in the work that you're doing as attorneys, like representing somebody who's arrested for shoplifting, or you're representing someone that's even charged with a violent crime, who knows. But what happens is it's not just that somebody has experienced trauma and then these are the ways that they cope. It's that somebody's experienced trauma, it is intolerable. That feeling of the trauma is intolerable, and so we need to figure out ways to tolerate the intolerable, if you will. And so it becomes like, using drugs, alcohol, hurting someone else, hurting yourself, isolation, these kinds of things. So again, if you're seeing a lot of these kinds of actions or reactions from people you're representing, it might be a heads up, like, hey, I wonder what's underneath this, what's going on, what's the root. Okay, so why then, if this is what's happening for many people, particularly survivors of trafficking, do people not come out with what's going on right away? And the reason for that is that secrecy, shame, and silence are truly hallmarks of traumatic experience. It's sort of what we expect from people as a society at large. It's what their perpetrators expect of them, meaning we don't really want to hear the voices of those that have been hurt. We ask people to stay silent, and that actual perpetrator might have said the same thing. What we do end up seeing a lot is shame, but shame comes across as anger. That we see people, you see this in court all the time when a charge is announced, let's say prostitution, and all of a sudden the defendant's stance changes, they might roll their eyes, they do whatever, they react to that because there's shame in it, right? So instead of saying, I'm so ashamed, they're going to react with anger because anger is protective, and shame makes us vulnerable. Okay, and last but not least is this complexity of choice. I think a lot of times people ask, well, why do people continuously end up in these traumatic, violent situations? Like, isn't one time did you learn a lesson? All those things that people like to say. And so this is an extremely simple way of thinking about it, but it's not. It's that often a traumatic moment leads to this period of time where somebody has to figure out how they're going to survive, and it often makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to more trauma. So for survivors of trafficking that we work with, right, perhaps there's a lot of violence going on at home. They can't be home for some reason. They leave home. They're out on their own, and they need to figure out how I'm going to survive, and again, are vulnerable. So maybe they meet somebody who ends up becoming their trafficker, right, and in some ways that's how they're surviving because that person's providing food, shelter, a sense of love, all of those things, but they're also now vulnerable to a whole lot of other trauma in their future, like all the things that were on those columns, right? So really just think about how complicated choice is, and if you think that this sounds completely not relevant to you, I ask you to think about, did you choose to go to college or did you choose to go to law school? And most people in a regular old conversation are going to say yes. But if you start dissecting that choice for a moment, what would your family's reactions be? What were your community's expectations? What would have happened if you didn't do those things? Choice becomes much more complicated. So again, just thinking about that these are things that survivors experience, but things that we can try to relate to our own lives. So I believe I'm now going to pass this on.
Well,
Christine.
Let me just, this is Kate Mogulescu, everyone, and so I think as a practitioner, listening to all of that, I begin to wonder, well, how can I, in my practice, actually, I know that I'm working with people that have experienced a lot of trauma, and this now seems daunting, right, because it's everywhere and could be everything, and my practice could be harmful to people. And so we're going to turn to Christine now for some really concrete exploration of how attorneys, in the work that we're doing with clients, need to know this but can also incorporate some of this knowledge. And I think that because as attorneys, often what we're doing with clients is so fact-based and narrative-based, and we're asking questions. I mean, that's a fundamental role of attorneys. There are some ways in which we can do that with all of this in mind. And so, Christine, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kate. And Miriam, thank you for sharing all of that perspective as well. So just quickly on the slide, I think as attorneys, we often have this expectation that of how our representation is going to go. And those of us who are civil legal service providers do understand that that is rarely what reality looks like. And when you are working with a survivor of trafficking and someone who has experienced a lot of trauma, we really need to be prepared for what reality of working with persons who have trauma in their background looks like, and how we need to reevaluate our expectations in order to prepare for that. So as Miriam shared with us, and as I hope you understand by now, our clients are not coming to us in a vacuum, that they're bringing with themselves all of their experiences from their entire lives, often many experiences of trauma, and also their own norms and culture as well. And we have to remember that in order to get the info that we need, or the information that we need to fully represent these clients, we're going to have to ask them to recall and at times relive very traumatic times in their lives. And so it's important for us to understand what reliving that trauma can look like in the context of our very specific legal work, and then to have some tools to address this. Now, I want to share just a little bit of where I'm coming from. As Kate said, I am the legal director of the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. We've been around since about 2006, so a little less time than Miriam's organization, actually quite a bit less time, but in 2009, we started providing legal services to survivors of sexual harm. And right now, I run a team of about there are 5 attorneys on our team and 2 paralegals, and we represent about 200 survivors of sexual harm a year. About 80% of those survivors are survivors of sexual assault outside of the context of trafficking and prostitution, and then about 20% are survivors of trafficking and forced prostitution. And what we found is that, especially when we're talking about trauma-informed and survivor-centered work, although a lot of our skills from our working with survivors of sexual assault do translate, there are a lot of additional things we need to think about when working with survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And so I want to share with you a little bit about that work and what it's looked like. I've been at CASE for almost 5 years now, but I've been working as a human rights lawyer for 16 years, and I've dealt with and worked with clients in many different types of coming out of many different traumatic situations and experiences, both here in the United States and overseas, specifically with representing survivors of trafficking, of labor and sex trafficking in India, and then survivors of forced prostitution in Zambia. So I have a fair amount of experience with what this looks like, but then also how cultural norms can affect these things, affect the way that you represent and work with survivors, and how we really need to step back and reflect on our own histories, experiences, and culture as we do this representation. So I want to provide you, from the perspective of an attorney, some tools and some things to think about as you are working with survivors. Okay, so as Miriam shared a lot of information with us about the effect of trauma, and I want to reiterate some of that, but then also provide just a little bit more information. We don't really have a lot of time to get into this more deeply than, of course, what Miriam shared with us, but I do want to share one resource if you want to get a little deeper into talking about the effect of trauma. Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who's I actually don't know if she's still at the University of Illinois, but she was. She has a webinar called The Neurobiology of Sexual Assault, and I require all of my new employees to watch it, because it really does help explain how trauma affects thinking, how it affects the ways memories are formed, and can really help you, as if you are not a neurobiologist like myself, think about how this trauma has affected your client, and help you understand a little bit better why certain reactions, or why they're having certain reactions, or they are telling stories in a certain way. So what research has shown us is that trauma really does affect how memories are coded. That as a survival mechanism, some memories are what's the word I'm looking for, are pushed down, are hidden, that they may come up later when someone's gone through some healing, or they may never return, or something, a smell or something that they see may trigger that memory that they didn't remember they had. And because of this, often when a survivor comes to us and shares their story, it might seem fragmented. That I put in the slide sketchy in quotes because I hear that a lot, especially from some of our pro bono attorneys. They'll say, oh, well, you know, they can give me tons of details about, you know, what their pimp's car looked like. But then when I ask them, you know, what happened when you didn't bring enough money back, how did your pimp react, all of a sudden everything gets sketchy, that they can't remember, or they're avoiding the question. And oftentimes it's because that might be where the abuse, the most of the abuse happened, or the most traumatic abuse happened. And so their memories are not being consolidated correctly or coded correctly, or completely. And so they can't put together the full story in a way that I think we as lawyers like to hear the stories put together in a nice chronological way that will make a lot of sense to a judge or a lot of sense to a jury, and have the next, and then what happened, tell the next part of the story. And so because of this, survivors really struggle with chronology. And if you try to force them into that framework, into that mold of chronology, you often won't get the full story. Or you will actually end up driving your client away from you and not allowing them to provide you full information. What you should do with this, and what this knowledge should tell you, is that you should expect inconsistencies across interviews. Now, I put inconsistencies in quotes here because it is not necessarily that the person is being inconsistent purposefully, or even with full knowledge of inconsistency. And you may find that as the story develops, or as you talk to them more, something they told you earlier that seemed inconsistent actually all comes together once you have another crucial detail. But those details may take a long time to come together. So what we need to think about is how can you allow a survivor that you're working with to work within their own system of taking the time they need to get memories out, to provide you the information. What we can say is that in your representation, the trauma will come to the surface again. And even after many, if there's been intervening years, the re-traumatization can affect the memory again. And so what we often do with our clients is that we will often tell them this is normal, that if they can't remember things or they're remembering things out of order, we just let them know that's fine. We'll take notes and we can always come back to it. And let them know that if they can't remember something, we know it's not because they're trying to hide it, but that we will work with them. One practice tip that I give is provide your clients a way to contact you or to share information with you basically as soon as they remember it. I wouldn't say, I did make a mistake at one point and told the client, you can send me a text anytime you remember something. And there were a couple nights where my phone kept lighting up next to my bed, even with the ringer off, because she kept remembering details, and led one from the next. So what we then did is we actually created a Google Doc in which she could put the information in there and know that I could access it immediately if I needed to. So I would say think about, the fact that sometimes dreams can trigger memories, or something that someone sees at night might trigger a memory, what have you. So providing a way for them to put that memory down and get it to you, because sometimes they feel that it's not enough to just write it down, that it needs to be sent to the person who is representing them as quickly as possible, but in a way that still allows you some time for self-care and boundaries. I also want to say with this slide of the best practice of, again, as I said, because it's a trauma impacts memory, you just shouldn't misinterpret the inability to provide full details as evasiveness or lying. But do take some time to be honest with your client. Probably not at the first meeting, maybe after you've built some rapport, to say, okay, there were some gaps we need to go back and try to fill in, and see if you can do that later. So don't force them to think through it chronologically your way, but do be willing to come back and confront those gaps later. Okay, I'm not sure if you all are seeing the next slide. Okay, there it came up for me. So now Miriam went over a lot of this, so I don't really want to get into it a lot, but I do want to reiterate that trauma responses are often counterintuitive. For those of you who have worked with survivors of any form of sexual violation or sexual harm, you'll have seen this, that you'll know that the world expects survivors to respond in a certain way, an appropriate number of tears, quick response of calling the police, what have you, but that the responses are actually often very counterintuitive. And I see this in many ways with our survivors of trafficking as well, and especially I want to point out the one here of shame, guilt, and self-blaming. The reason I want to point this out specifically for survivors of trafficking is because we see this a lot. I know this does happen, and I see it all the time with my survivors, the clients that we work with who are survivors of sexual assault. But I find that not only do our clients who are survivors of trafficking have this self-guilt, the shame, guilt, and self-blaming, but it's also expected of them, perhaps because of some of their programs they're in to help heal. So those of us who have worked with trafficking survivors know that a lot of them have dependency on an addiction on illegal drugs, alcohol, what have you, in order to help cope, and that a lot of them are going through rehab or have gone through rehab or in a 12-step program as a way to get over that addiction or as part of their healing process. And a lot of these programs focus on taking responsibility for your addiction, taking responsibility for your dependency. And so what we'll often hear from our clients, and I see this especially for those who may have transitioned from their own healing to helping others heal, is this need to take responsibility for what happened to them. So we often hear from them, well, when I was deep in the throes of my addiction, I did these things. And they'll negate the fact that there might have been a pimp or a trafficker who was driving a lot of what happened. And so we have to really kind of work through some of those responses in order to get down to the actual force that was used or the coercion that was used to bring them into trafficking. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, about how to get through that in a little bit. And I should also say that I know none of us, well, I think we do have a social worker, at least one social worker on here, but for those of us with lawyers, we are not trained therapists. A lot of us have not been trained through how to deal with the responses to trauma, but knowing this information, that this is what you may see working with survivors, you should take some time to become prepared for any and all of these reactions. Something you might want to think about, have you or your organization had any form of crisis intervention training? Do you have any persons in your office who are social workers or therapists who can be resources for you to help you? And also, I'll talk a little bit, a bit about building a network of those resources as well. Okay, so again, this is a bit of a reiteration of what Miriam said, but as we know, trauma can affect every aspect of a person's life. And so one point of trauma does not mean that once that's over, once they've healed from that, that the effects are not going to continue. Oftentimes trauma leads to a smaller non-existent support system, which could create continuing safety concerns where they cut themselves off from other people because they don't have as much trust. And then when they try to get help from the system itself could re-traumatize them. If you think about clients that we have who are coming for vacatur, they have been arrested by police officers, put into the criminal justice system, and they themselves were treated as the criminals when they were being victimized. So there's this continued re-traumatization throughout their lives that has created a destabilized society for them, community for them. So the question you want to ask is, how can you be a stabilizing influence in their life? And how can you do work that is not part of re-traumatization? How can you ensure your work is not part of this re-traumatizing system? So what we say is that you need to become survivor-centered and trauma-informed. Not just you and your work, but your organization, where your practice and who you work with, or the people that your survivors will interact with as part of your organization. And the number one goal you should have is to ensure your clients feel empowered when they are working with you. As Miriam noted, a traumatized participant has had their power and control taken away from them, often throughout their lives through many traumatic experiences. So what you should be focusing on is giving your clients control and choices whenever you can, so as to help them feel more powerful and help them feel more engaged. We say around here an empowered client is an engaged client. We find that clients who feel that they're part of their case, part of what we're doing for them, that we are relying on them to help make decisions, and that we want to know how they want to move forward, are the ones who are most engaged. Those who think, oh, my lawyer will do everything for me, and if we just take that and don't ask them for feedback, don't ask them for assistance in making decisions, they're the ones that are the hardest to reach, who often are the most disengaged, or the ones that, especially so if we take away those choices. If we say, we're the lawyers, we know what we're doing, we're not going to listen to you, or we know what's best, they will completely disengage, and often we won't even be able to reach them and therefore get assistance with decisions when we actually need them. I'll talk a little bit about how do you help empower your client in just a minute. Okay, so if you give your client control and help them empower them, they are more likely to engage with you. And they're more likely to tell you when they have concerns. But we do want to highlight for you a few of the common client concerns, and ones where they might not want to tell you, and it might require you to share, to empower them to engage with you on these issues. You know, the ultimate thing, this line of client concerns in which we say, at the end, should I tell my lawyer? The ultimate answer here is we want our clients to be able to say yes, that they feel empowered to talk to you, that they're engaged with the work, and that they have trust that you will be able to either answer the questions or help them find a response. So a lot of the common client concerns really arise from not only trauma impact, but also the different circumstances that your clients are coming from compared to what they're going to be seeing from you. So even if perhaps, you know, you may have grown up in the same neighborhood, you might be the same race, the same ethnicity, speak the same language, the fact that you are an attorney who's gone to law school, passed the bar, is working for a good organization may put you in a completely different place than your client who is a survivor of trafficking. And so the number one thing is to assume, never to assume that you know what your client's concerns are, and to empower them to talk to you about that. So some of the questions about your lawyer knows nothing about the circumstances I grew up in. My lawyer asked me so many questions and I don't remember the answers. Is my lawyer judging me because I was engaged in survival sex for a number of years, or because I was addicted to heroin? And even to the most practical things of, my lawyer wants me to come to their office and meet in person, but their office is way in a neighborhood that's not very accessible from the buses or the public transportation, and I don't have money for transportation. Where am I going to find a bus card or something like that? So there's going to be a lot of concerns that come up with your clients, and you want to have them, bring them to a place where they feel like they can speak to you about it. What we try to do is we reiterate every time we meet with our clients, or even if we have to, every time we talk to them, that they're walking into what we call a judgment-free zone. You know, I try to tell my clients, and you know, it works sometimes, I'm sorry, that although, you know, we probably look very different, or, you know, they think I come from a very different place, that I am not here to judge them, I'm here to work for them. I often say to my clients, I work for you. I am your employee here. What can I do for you? What do I need to know to help you? And one thing I have done in the past, and some, you know, it really you have to decide with your client, is I'll share a story about a client who didn't tell me everything, that she was afraid how I might be judging her, so she didn't share with me a number of text messages between her and John, because she was worried about how I might judge her. And unfortunately, those messages came out later, and I had to scramble to deal with that issue. Thankfully, we were able to overcome it, but it really put me back on my heels. And in a way, you know, it put me in a place where I completely represent her to the best of my ability. And some clients react really well to that, of saying, okay, here Christina is sharing with me a situation in which she felt like she couldn't do her job fully. How can I work with her to ensure that doesn't happen again? Some clients feel a little blamed by those types of stories, so you kind of have to determine for yourself what works best. One other point I do want to make here is some of your clients' concerns you might not have the answers to, but this is why you need to really have a network of services that you can help surround your client with, and I'll talk about that towards the end. Okay, so now that you know it's important to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed, what can you do to ensure that you are survivor-centered? So for, and I'm saying you, but I want to say not just the individual lawyer or social worker, prosecutor, whoever you might be, but also your organization as a whole, because it doesn't really matter if you are the only person who is survivor-centered in your organization. Your clients will see other people are not taking their concerns into account, whether you have other people doing your intakes, people greeting them at the door, that they're interacting with other attorneys in your office. So you need to think about, is your entire organization, is the entire system that your client is going to be interacting with, that you have control over, or you have a part in, is that survivor-centered? And for some organizations, this will really involve a fundamental shift in approach, and for others, it will mean enhancing your existing practice to really look at the particular ways that trauma can affect us and affect our survivors. And although a trauma-informed approach is already consistent with principles of any kind of real legal aid advocacy, it really is more than just good advocacy practice. And it really does involve a change in the way we understand our work, the structure of our organizations, and how we fundamentally interact with survivors. So this first question of what's happened to your life, what's happened to you, it's a way of thinking. It's not specifically asking you to ask yourself that, although that self-reflection is important. It's more a way of how do you interact with your clients, of asking what's happened in their life and what's happened to them, instead of saying, what's wrong with you? What is your problem? But really look at how the trauma that has happened to them has affected them personally. And understanding that impact of the trauma on the individual, understanding all the trauma reactions that Miriam shared with us and the ways these reactions can be expressed, but also understanding that trauma reactions are really normal and recognizing them as survival strategies. And if you can, helping your client see and recognize them as normal and survival strategies as well, so that they can kind of have this name and claim type of attitude of if they understand how these reactions fit into the trauma they experienced and how reliving that trauma or recalling that trauma can bring it to the surface again. Okay, so becoming survivor-centered really requires a specific awareness of how trauma can affect our own responses and interactions with others as well. And as I was saying before, in the last slide, it really does involve a change in the way we understand our work. And so we need to think not just about how trauma affects our clients, but what we have to do in order to ensure that our organization as a whole is open and friendly and welcoming to survivors. So the first thing is kind of removing pathology or dysfunction. So if there is I would say take some time to reflect on your organization, and if there is kind of dysfunction in the organization, understanding that that is going to affect your ability to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed in representing survivors. It's important to understand that while you're being transparent and flexible with your clients, you also have to have firm boundaries. This is extremely important. Like I was saying before, you know, I had a client that when I knew she would want to try to get in contact with me whenever she remembered something. So I gave her my phone number to text me whenever she needed to. And that was perhaps not the best way to set boundaries with that particular client, because she liberally used that phone number and would text me anytime, day and night, over the weekend. But how do you set those firm boundaries to ensure that you are accessible to your client and you're flexible with them, but then also ensuring that you yourself are being protected and have self-care. So the next one of practitioner and client both have the knowledge. That means that don't assume that your client understands everything that's going on, because you do. Don't assume knowledge. If you have information that is important for your client to know, to understand, then you should share that information with your client. They might say, yeah, I know that, but at least you know they have that knowledge. So ensure that the client has as much information as you have, because that will help them stay more engaged and feel more empowered. And then the final point I want to make here is that you should expect that you, as the worker working with survivors of trafficking, working with persons who have been affected by trauma, that you will also be impacted by that. I'm sure everyone here has heard about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout, but you know, just always keep that forefront in mind, that this is something that that you should keep in mind.
And Christine, I'm just going to pause us very quickly to give the program code, except I can't do it. Ah, there it is. Yes, I can do it. So the participant verification code is on the screen now. You'll be asked to enter this code in the online attendance following this program. We strongly encourage folks who are taking this program for CLE credit to write down this code. The ABA participation verification code is 944-19579. That code again is 944-19579. And Christine, I can turn it back over to you now.
Great.
It's always nice to do that in a way that totally interrupts your flow. I hope I did that in the most interrupting way possible.
It was fantastic. Thank you. But it actually let me realize that I have way more slides than I have time. So I'm gonna speed through a little bit of this. I actually, getting back to talking about becoming survivor-centered, you know, I did talk at the end of the last slide of that you have to be prepared that this working with persons who have been affected by trauma and having them speak about their trauma to you regularly is going to affect you. And it's very important to take some time and create some space for self-reflection, and to think about your responses to each individual survivor and how these responses are affecting you, but also how they might be reflecting your client. Now, I'm not going to go through, because we don't have much time, much more of this. What I would say is the URL that's at the bottom of this slide, the VAWnet, has some great resources about becoming a trauma-informed organization or how to become survivor-centered. So I encourage you to look at that and to maybe even do a checklist evaluation of your own organization and yourself to see, to really determine how survivor-centered are you, how trauma-informed are you. Okay, so in terms of becoming survivor-centered, with each specific client, it's going to look differently. But I want to give you a few just practical tips of working with an individual client, what that looks like. So as attorneys, we probably know an important thing to do is build that rapport and trust with every client. But specifically with survivors of sexual exploitation, sexual violation, probably the first thing that I say is to start by believing. As I noted previously, these survivors are used to not being believed, of being blamed for things that have happened in their lives. And your clients need to know that they are safe with you. And so give them their time to share their stories and to take ownership of their stories and their truth. Now I say this is not a time for you to be a lawyer. It's kind of, I know you're acting as a lawyer, but especially during that first meeting, don't play devil's advocate. Don't examine both sides. Let them tell their stories and just respond as a human being, responding in a respectful and dignified way, acknowledge their feelings and reactions, saying things like, that sounds really difficult, you seem like you're very frustrated, can you tell me a little bit more about that, is the best way to respond instead of saying, well, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but say, well, weren't you actually stealing from John's at that time, or weren't you the one who decided to go to this street, or doesn't that seem like a time you could have gotten away? Something like that. Don't go into cross-examination. Let them tell their stories the way they need to tell their stories. Another thing I find very important is to share your information before asking for it. Sometimes we rush straight in. As lawyers, we're really busy. We've got a lot on our plates. So we forget to take the time to explain who we are, what our roles are, what our jobs are as their attorneys, or what you're doing in an intake or a consultation, whatever it might be, and to take some time to explain what privilege and confidentiality mean, and any caveats you might have to that. Just really set a good stage of saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm giving to you, these are my responsibilities and my role, before you ask for anything back from them. What I do find is that it's really important to kind of set an agenda and some goals for the meeting. I often ask the client to say, what would you like to get done today? Let them have some control and agency. If I do need to take that control and say, this is what we're going to do today, I always say, how does that sound with you? Sound to you? And let them kind of dictate how the case happens. So we only have about 2 more minutes, so I just want to do a couple quick other points in terms of getting the story. The important thing is do not force a focus on that chronology, and spend some time asking open questions, letting them jump around and take it in chunks if you have to, and know that you can go back to a certain area. A number one thing that not number one, but a main thing that I always want to say is avoid asking those why questions. Try to avoid asking, why did you do this? Instead, asking, what were you feeling at the time? That type of thing, so that there is a lack of blame for the trauma that occurred to them. One thing that we try to do a lot is help them focus on their reality at the time and not in hindsight. A lot of times we will have clients say, well, thinking of it now, I should have done this. There's no shoulds in this. Help them focus on what their reality was at the time and help them understand that their survival responses were often born out of their trauma and that there is no blame in that. Okay, the final thing I want to say is, recognize your own limitations. Create a circle of services for your clients and know about what services are available in your community, even if they're not trafficking specific. So look for trauma specialized therapists and counselors. Look at your rape crisis centers, DV services, and even housing and employment services for maybe people who have low housing stability or homelessness, and create partnerships with those networks. And don't try to do that work yourself. You're a lawyer, you're not a social worker, you're not a case manager. Understand your limitations. Communicate those to your client, but then also provide a circle of services to help them truly be engaged and empowered in this work. I'm not going to have time for the last two things. The VAWnet has some really great things on that as well. But thank you all. Am I handing this back to Kate, I think now?
Yes.
But thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. We're about to conclude today's webinar, but I really wanted to thank both Christine and Miriam for their tremendous expertise here. This is something that we all need to be factoring into our practice, and I think today gave us a lot to chew on and think about and incorporate. For that, we also encourage you to visit our website at the Survivor Reentry Project, www.ambar.org/SRP. Whether you have experience working with survivors in post-conviction cases or are first-time attorneys or non-attorneys delving into this work, we're here to support you any way that we can. Contact us for more assistance, case-specific, general. We'd be happy to talk more. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie Carlson.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you in particular to our presenters, Kate Mogulescu, Christine Evans, and Miriam Goodman, for sharing your time and expertise on how to best work with and support survivors of trafficking in post-conviction cases. On behalf of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, thank you all for joining us today. Before leaving, please wait for the evaluation and CLE information to come up on your screen. I'll now turn you over to our operator for some additional information.
Thank you, Bonnie. And ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned before, if you have any additional questions, please submit a technical assistance request form on the Survivor Reentry Project website, ambar.org/SRP. /SRP. On behalf of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and the ABA Center for Professional Development, thank you for participating in this program. For those of you who want CLE credit, please click on the link now appearing in the presentation window. This will open the program evaluation. After you submit the evaluation, the attendance confirmation form and request for CLE credit will appear. Please complete the information requested on the form and submit. Your information will be verified, and if your attendance meets all the requirements for CLE credit, your certificates will be emailed to you. Thank you again for participating in this program, and please have a good day.